The air inside the Sterling Innovations boardroom was thick with tension, the kind that made even the most seasoned executives sit up straighter. This was a high-stakes meeting that could determine the company's future, but no one was prepared for what happened next. When Victoria Langford walked in, she wasn't alone. Her sharp heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved with the kind of quiet authority that made even the most arrogant men in the room shrink in their seats. But it wasn't her presence that left the executives stunned. It was the man walking beside her. Jonah Reid didn't belong there. His uniform wasn't an expensive suit but a faded gray janitor's jumpsuit. A cleaning rag was still clutched in his hand, as if he had been dragged into the meeting straight from the maintenance closet. Silence stretched across the room as executives exchanged bewildered glances. The CFO, Ethan Callaway, cleared his throat and forced a polite smile. "Ms. Langford, Victoria raised a hand, cutting him off. "I invited him." Jonah looked down, clearly uncomfortable, his shoulders stiff. He wasn't making eye contact with anyone, and it was obvious he felt out of place. He had spent years being invisible, just another worker cleaning up after people who never acknowledged him. But today, every eye in the boardroom was locked onto him, like he was an alien who had just crash-landed into their world. Victoria took her seat at the head of the long glass table and let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. "I know what you're all thinking," she said, her voice calm. "And I don't care." She leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. "A few weeks ago, I was walking past the staff break room when I overheard a conversation. It wasn't small talk. It wasn't someone complaining about work. It was a discussion about investment strategies." She scanned the room. I stopped. At first, I thought one of our financial advisors had wandered into the wrong room. But the voice was unfamiliar. It was steady, thoughtful, filled with the kind of knowledge that comes from experience, not theory. The executives listened, skeptical but curious. Victoria let the moment stretch before continuing. I peered in and saw Jonah sitting at the table, explaining complex financial concepts to another maintenance worker. And he wasn't just talking. He was breaking down market trends with the kind of insight that makes hedge fund managers nervous. Jonah shifted uncomfortably, but Victoria wasn't finished. I stayed and listened for 15 minutes. He talked about market cycles, undervalued assets, and risks that most people overlook. Not with the flashy jargon of Wall Street, but with the clarity of someone who actually understands money. The room was silent. Some executives exchanged glances, while others focused on Jonah. Their curiosity piqued. Ethan let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "With all due respect, Ms. Langford, today's meeting is about critical financial decisions. I don't see how he—" Victoria smirked. "That's funny, Ethan, because last week when I overheard Jonah explaining long-term investment strategies, he made more sense than half of you do in these meetings." A few people coughed awkwardly. Jonah swallowed hard but remained quiet. Victoria continued. "Our company is hemorrhaging money in logistics. We've been sitting in these meetings for months with no real solution. So today, Jonah is here to weigh in." A ripple of disbelief passed through the room. Ethan crossed his arms. "By all means," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Impress us." Jonah's throat was dry, his palms sweaty. He wasn't supposed to be here. But then he thought about his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about finance before life forced him onto a different path. He remembered the late nights studying market reports, the years of watching executives make flawed decisions while he scrubbed floors. He exhaled and met Ethan's gaze. "You're worried about underperforming assets, right?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Obviously," Jonah nodded. Not out of nervousness, but because he already knew the answer to the problem no one in the room had been able to solve. "I read the reports. The issue isn't the assets. It's how you're evaluating them." Another murmur swept through the room. One of the junior analysts, Rachel Lynn, looked down at her tablet, scrolling quickly. Ethan scoffed. "And how do you suggest we evaluate them?" Jonah leaned forward. "The same way a smart investor looks at a company during a recession. Not by its current value, but by its potential value." Silence. Victoria smiled. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. Then Jonah started breaking down numbers, real numbers, the kind even the top executives had overlooked. The energy in the room shifted. A few minutes ago he had been an outsider, but now they were listening, really listening. Ethan's smirk was gone. He leaned forward. "All right," he said carefully. "Let's say we evaluate potential value instead of current value. What exactly are we missing?" Jonah exhaled. This was his moment. "The logistics division," he said without hesitation. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "How did you—" "I read the reports," Jonah interrupted. "You're bleeding money because you're outsourcing distribution instead of optimizing internally." A hush fell over the table. Jonah continued, his confidence growing. "Your outsourcing costs have increased by 12% in the last 2 quarters, but your internal fleet is running at less than 50% capacity. That means you're paying premium rates for services you already have the infrastructure to handle yourself." Rachel was still scrolling, her eyes widening. "He's right," she muttered. Jonah pressed on. "Instead of cutting jobs, restructure the distribution model. Use the fleet. Cut outsourcing by 30%. That alone saves at least $8 million annually." A stunned silence filled the room. Ethan's face was unreadable, but Rachel whispered something to a colleague, who nodded. Victoria finally spoke. "That's why Jonah is here." Ethan ran a hand over his jaw. "You figured this out just by reading reports?" Jonah hesitated, then shrugged. "I pay attention." More executives exchanged glances, some impressed, some uneasy. But Victoria was smiling. She turned to Ethan. "How long have we been looking for a financial consultant?" Ethan shifted. 6 months. Victoria nodded and turned to Jonah. "Want the job?" Jonah took a deep breath and said the one word that would change his life forever. "Yes." But this was only the beginning. As the meeting ended, Jonah felt the weight of his decision settle in. The real challenge was yet to come. Now he had to prove himself not just once but every single day. He had been given an opportunity, but the corporate world was ruthless. Some in the room were already waiting for him to fail. Victoria walked beside him as they exited the boardroom. "Be ready, Jonah. The hardest part starts now." Jonah straightened his shoulders. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And as he stepped into his new role, he had no idea just how much his life was about to change.